Good evening. My name is Sarah Slade and I'm the Head of Storage and Digital Collection Services here at State Library Victoria. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the policy pitch. And tonight's topic, as you're aware, is Generation Less, exploring the economic challenge for young Australians. This seminar is held on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I'd like to give a warm welcome to tonight's speakers, Danielle Wood, Jennifer Rayner and Professor Rodney Maddock, Grattan Institute members and staff and friends of the library. The policy pitch presented by Grattan Institute and State Library Victoria is a series in which experts and thinkers tackle some of the most important problems facing Australians. This partnership contributes to one of the library's major aims, which is to be a catalyst for ideas, discussion and debate. The series includes the brightest minds in the fields of public policy and brings to the library highly engaged and well-informed audiences. So you should all feel very proud. It creates a space for in-depth discussion and reflection on important policy issues. This is one of the broad range of programs offered by the State Library and our partners. And if you'd like to know more, I'd encourage you to pick up our Autumn What's On brochure or have a look at our website to keep abreast of our free community programs. Tonight we will explore the emerging political and economic concerns around intergenerational inequality and what we should do about it. It's clearly a topic of great interest and it's very satisfying to see so many here this evening. Danielle, Jennifer and Rodney, I'm looking forward to hearing your observations and solutions, and I'm pleased now to introduce Danielle Wood, who will introduce the panellists and lead the discussion. Danielle is the Australian Perspectives Fellow at Grattan Institute, and she's also worked at the ACCC, NERA Economic Consulting and the Productivity Commission. Please join me in welcoming Danielle.
Thank you very much for that, Sarah, and thank you to the State Library for again having us here tonight in this great venue. I'm thrilled to see so many people here for what I hope will be a very thought-provoking discussion. By my calculations, we have 3 generations on the stage, so hopefully we can get the broadest possible... four if we count humans to be. The broadest possible range of perspectives on this very challenging issue of intergenerational inequality. Our representative of Generation Y on the far left is Jennifer Rayner. I think if anyone was able to single-handedly dispel the myth of a lazy and entitled generation, it would be Jennifer. Jennifer has a PhD from ANU. She's had a career as a political advisor, as an international youth ambassador, and a consultant, as well as the not insubstantial job of raising a toddler, all before her 30th birthday. Jennifer has added to her already great accomplishments with the release of her first book, Generation Less, How Australia is Cheating its Young. I have been recommending this book to anyone that will listen, particularly some of my less politically engaged friends, because Jennifer has a real gift of delving into some pretty meaty policy topics, youth unemployment, housing policy, mental health issues, all in a way that's really informative and engaging. And she brings a lot of herself to the book. You certainly feel like you know Jennifer a lot better at the end of it. The other thing I really like about the book is she does a great job of diagnosing some of the problems, but she also talks a lot about solutions. So what governments can do and what individuals can do to make a difference to this problem. So these books will be for sale after the event, and Jen will be signing copies, I believe. Sure. So I would encourage everyone to have a look at that. At the other end of the generational spectrum, we have Professor Rod Maddock. Rod has described himself in his introduction as a curmudgeonly baby boomer, but certainly in my experience of Rod, nothing could be further from the truth. Rod has had a very distinguished career as an economist in both the public and private sector. He now largely contributes to the public policy debate through his roles as an academic at both Monash and Victoria University. Rod is the CEDA Director and is President of the Victorian branch of the Economic Society. So Jennifer and I are delighted to have Rod as our token older male on the panel tonight. And finally, as Sarah's already introduced me, I'm a fellow at the Grattan Institute. I work mainly on tax and budget policy, but we have also sort of dipped our toes into this issue of intergenerational inequality with the report that I put out with John Daly at the end of 2014 called Wealth of Generations. So as part of that report, we've looked at trends in income and wealth, government taxes and spending by age group and how they've changed over time. And the view that we came to at the end of that exercise was really that there's a real chance that today's generation of young Australians could be worse off than their parents over their lifetime. So, what is intergenerational inequality and should we care? So the way I was thinking we would approach it tonight is to get down into some of the specific policy issues around employment, around income, around wealth, around government spending. But before we sort of delve into those policy weeds, I wanted to give Jennifer and Rod a chance to sort of introduce themselves, introduce their ideas around this topic, because they come from quite different places when they think about these issues. So the question I would pose to both Jen and Rod is, are today's young being systematically disadvantaged by the economic and political system? And is this something as a society we should be worried about? So Jennifer, would you like to kick off?
Sure. Well, I think my answer to that is pretty predictable, given that introduction. And before I start, I would like to thank very much the Grattan Institute for having us here tonight, and also the State Library, and to Danny and John for the really important work that they did with that Wealth of Generations report. And it was one of the data points which actually really kicked off my thinking about the issues that I've raised in the book. Where I started from with that book was primarily in conversations with friends and colleagues and people my own age. And as those conversations sort of went on over the years, it occurred to me that we kept coming back to the same set of themes. We kept coming back to feeling like we were falling behind in work, in wealth, certainly, compared to where we saw our parents at the same age and where we would like to be at the ages that we are, and then also in well-being as a result of those two previous things. And so I went back and started having a look at the data on this, and I'm really clear throughout the book that I don't think we should be engaging in a conversation about boomers versus Gen Y and Gen X and that really confrontational frame. I think it's actually more helpful if we just start looking at what's happening to people who are in their 20s and 30s today compared to people in their 20s and 30s in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, and look at that sort of more fact-based comparison, I suppose. And what I found when I went and did that work was that there are gaps which have always existed between older and younger Australians. So I say in the book, being POV in your 20s is a life cycle effect. You just haven't had as much time to build up wealth as older people. But what's happening now is that those gaps are widening out, and they're widening out in ways which don't seem to have any option for reversal unless we actually change some policy settings. So to just give a couple of quick numbers, which we'll probably delve into this a bit more later on, but when my parents were looking for work when leaving school in the late 70s, less than 1 in 30 young people said that they were underemployed. Now today that number's up to about 1 in 6. So 1 in 6 people in their late teens, early 20s say that they can't get enough work. Similarly, we've seen the rate of people working casually go from about 30% to over 50% in the last 20 years. And that's happening not just amongst people who go to university, and because that's often the common response. Well, young people go to university more, and so therefore they don't need full-time jobs. But it's actually happening across the board. And it's a great academic at the University of Melbourne, Jeff Borland, who I can't recommend highly enough, does labour market economics, and he's had a look at that as well and came to the same conclusion. And so then in terms of things like wealth, we all know housing is a huge, huge issue in the affordability of it. So I talk in the book about how when my parents were starting out, housing was about 3 times average incomes, and saving a deposit you could do in, a year or two with really dedicated saving. Today, it's up to 6 times average incomes for across the community, and it can be up to 9 or 12 times average incomes for young people, depending on which city you're trying to buy in. And then, of course, that means that the deposit gap, what it takes you to save, is 6 or 9 years compared to 1 or 2 years. And then the implication of that is that young people's lives are just much less secure now than they used to be. If we're in casual work and we can't get enough work, if we're moving around a lot because we don't own houses and live in one place, then that has a whole range of implications for the choices that we make about picking partners and putting down roots and all that kind of thing. As Danny's mentioned, I have a little one, but I'm very unusual in my age cohort to have a 5-year-old and to have been married and decided it wasn't for me say, and have kind of moved through those life stages already. Most people my age are still only thinking about doing those things as they enter their 30s. So I guess the point that I was trying to make is not to say that there are gaps between young and old, because those gaps have always been there. It's to say that they're widening out in ways that are really worrying because they appear to be systemic, they appear to be the result of policies which are in place and show no possibility of changing at the moment, and which will only get worse if we don't do something about them.
Okay. I think exactly the opposite. There you go. Great start. Well, the next generation is going to live about 8 years longer than my generation. That is an enormous benefit, and really one which shouldn't be underestimated. 8 extra years of life. That's massive. Your adult life, when I was born, life expectancy was 66 years. I think I'd be dead, actually, if I was the average person born in the year I was born in. So the next generation is going to live 8 years longer. That's huge. They've got access to communications, life experiences, international travel, food, range of languages, range of clients. You've been to Indonesia. I knew lots of people in Queensland growing up in the 1970s who had never been out of Queensland, let alone out of Australia. So the richness of your lives is actually very much bigger than anybody who grew up in the Menzies era. And so I just think you really completely underestimate that. The other things you've got to think about are, what did the baby boomers actually experience? You cited the example of your parents getting their first job in the 70s. Well, of course, in 1980, the unemployment rate was 10%. You haven't seen anything like that. 1990, it was again 10%. You haven't seen anything like that. Inflation rate in the 1970s was, nearly 20%. You haven't seen anything like that. We bought a house, and within 6 months, our interest rate went up 6%. We bought a house in 1988, I think it was, and I think we paid 14% initially as our mortgage rate compared to what you pay now. And it went within 6 months to 20%. Just imagine, we almost lost our house. What's more, the price of our house, the value of our house fell 20% over the next 2 years. So we had negative equity in our housing. So the story that your parents just waltzed into a house, put down 10%, and it was just an escalator forever to be rich is just wrong. I mean, that is not the experience that I lived through. We think back about the generation as well. Of course, none of your friends have been forced to go and fight in Vietnam. A whole lot of my friends were conscripted and forced against their will to go and fight in another country. You don't face any of that. I mean, it's a much better place than it used to be. Our parents fought the Second World War, but of course what you probably have forgotten, they actually borrowed to finance it. So when our generation entered, when I was born, the debt to GDP ratio was 200%. By the time you were born, it was very close to zero. So our generation paid off all of the debt of the previous generation, twice national income. That's something that we actually did. The other thing you've got to remember is when we were born into a generation which followed one which had been through the Depression and the Second World War. There was virtually no infrastructure built in those 20 years. So we built the infrastructure. Look out around these streets, other than the ones built in the 1880s, virtually everything was constructed by our generation and paid for by our generation. You have got better lives, richer lives, longer lives, better infrastructure, and more options than we had. I really think it's generation more, not generation less.
Well, thank you. I think that very much sets the tone for the discussion tonight. We're obviously going to have some very interesting discussions. So I wanted to start with employment, and both of you touched on that in your opening. As we know, employment prospects for young people in particular have been quite dire since the global financial crisis. We now see the youth unemployment rate at about 12% compared to 6% for the general population. Rod, do you think what we're seeing there is just a cyclical effect, or are there underlying structural problems, and are there things that government should be doing about it?
Okay. Yeah, we saw something similar in the 1990s. What happens when employment growth slows is basically anybody who's trying to enter or re-enter the workforce finds it very hard to find a job. You don't just look at the moment at the youth unemployment figures, have a look at the duration of unemployment. The number of people who spent more than a year looking for a job has doubled since 2007. And so it's not a generational issue, it's a fact that anybody who is out of the workforce and trying to get back into it has serious problems at the moment. The most obvious thing is to actually have more growth. If we have more growth, we have jobs growth, and then everybody will find it easier to get jobs. It is what happened in the 1990s, and I think much of it will disappear as we get through the current period of very slow job growth.
Yes, it's not actually the youth unemployment rate that concerns me as much, because youth unemployment is not that much higher than it has been at various other points, and in some cases quite a bit lower. It's some of the other trends that I mentioned earlier which more concern me. So the rise in underemployment, where people are in work notionally but they can't actually get enough work to support themselves, and so are ending up working 2 or 3 part-time jobs in order to stitch together a full income. And then the extent of the time that they spend doing that as well. So no longer is it just a thing that you do in your early 20s while you're studying, that continues to extend later into life. It's also the rise in casual work, and there's a lot of views about casual work, and there are a lot of good things to it for people who are using it to, supplement study or return to work after, caring responsibilities and all those kinds of things. But one thing that's really concerning about casual work is that employers don't invest in casual staff the way that they do in permanent staff. And so younger people, particularly who come into the workforce without having other forms of training, whether it's at university or TAFE or something like that, if they come into the workforce and then they work in casual jobs and they do that for a decade or longer, then the likelihood that they will have had any kind of investment in their ongoing advancement, their ongoing training, is pretty low. And what that then means is that their capacity to move on to more permanent, more secure work and advance in their careers in the way that previous generations would have, for example, if they worked in a factory and then were given on-the-job training, is actually diminished. So what worries me more is some of those trends locking younger people into what's known as the precariat, where as they grow older, they have no path forward in the workplace. That's what worries me.
And I think we see that when we look at the income statistics. So you've got some of these in your book, Jen, and we used the census data in our Wealth of Generations report. We see that we have had income growth across all age groups over the past decade, but we've certainly seen income growth for younger cohorts has been much slower over that time. Rod, do you see that as an issue? As long as everyone's incomes are going up, does it matter that young people's income growth is falling behind?
Tricky question. As a basic philosophical position, I think that we can tolerate inequality in our society as long as the poor are getting better, getting richer. So it's a Rawlsian philosophical position, and that's sort of my underlying philosophy. So generally, as long as the poor are getting better, then I think that that's much better than what you've got going on in the US, where the poor are getting poorer. Yeah? So I'm happy with many of those things. Yes, of course, you'd hope that no generation has slower growth than other generations. Obviously, the nature of work is changing really dramatically. Women's participation rate has doubled over the period that we're talking about, comparing generations. So women have got a lot more opportunities, and a lot more women are in permanent work than used to not be in work at all, really. And so times have changed a lot.
The rate of women working in full-time work has been pretty much static for about the last 20 years, so we're not making really gains there. It's at that casual work, part-time work, which personally, as a woman who works part-time and sees that as therefore sees the obstacles that women experience in career progression, for example, working part-time versus full-time is a really big factor in that.
Yeah, but it's much better than the generation before, which didn't even have that option.
All right, well, why don't we move on to talk about another area of even more sort of substantially growing disparity between the cohorts, and that is wealth. If you look at the latest ABS data, you see a quite stark pattern emerging. So an average household 65 to 74 years old today has about $400,000 more wealth in real terms than a household of that same age 10 years ago. In contrast, if we look at households 25 to 34-year-olds today, their wealth has barely moved over that decade. So what we see is really strong disparity in wealth accumulation by people of different age groups. As Jen said in her introduction, a lot of that is a story about housing. When you have a situation where house prices have outstripped growth in incomes for 15 years, unsurprisingly, if you owned a house at the start of that period, you've had a very substantial windfall gain. In contrast, if you're a young person trying to get into the market today, it is going to take you a substantially longer to save up a deposit for an average home. Jen and Rod, question to both of you. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the economic and social consequences of that growing wealth divide? And how do you think high house prices are going to affect young people's opportunity to get into the housing market going forward.
So housing is a really good example of something that I mention in the book, which is not that there is any one problem for young people at the moment, but it's about the way that a bunch of different problems are coming together. And so the fact that house prices are escalating so much, or have escalated so much in the last few years, that prices are starting to moderate a bit now, combined with slower wage growth, means that people are always, housing is a little bit further out of reach every time they've almost got the deposit together. So that's a really nice example of what's happening in a range of areas where we're seeing different problems come together in ways that compound on each other. But I think generally there's this idea that people will be able to set themselves up in life and build, wealth and build stability as they go forward. And really, when I think about intergenerational equity, that's what I think is young people having the same opportunities to build stable and secure lives that our parents had and our grandparents had. If you take housing out of the picture, you take away a really significant part of that wealth creation and that building block for a stable and a secure life. And the social consequence of that is there are personal consequences, as I've reflected on. So people put off having families, they put off partnering up and paring down and building the kind of, and it's not for everybody, admittedly, but the kind of nice suburban lives that a lot of us would be familiar with. And then the broader social impact of that, I think we are seeing play out at the moment, where there is genuine frustration and then there is genuine anger in some parts from younger people towards older people, because we see what they have and we don't see a path to obtaining that.
Yeah, it's a very traditional argument you've made. Wow. You look at a country like Germany, and what percentage of people own their houses? 40%. A very rich country, just in a different way of organising their society. So there's no particular golden rule which says everybody has to own a house. So it's a very, as I said, a very traditional argument as you've put. Think about the traditional argument. Yeah, the traditional lifestyle was you get married, you save up like hell to buy a house, you have your kids, you're really poor for a decade, and then gradually you get on top of your mortgage, and then you hit your late 50s, your kids disappear, and you start saving like hell for retirement. Yeah, that's the sort of standard model. Well, of course, we've got superannuation in the way at the moment. You've got to put 10% of your income into superannuation to fund you when you're bloody 65, so you can't buy a house. You need a house, and you need an income, and in retirement you need both. And the superannuation system has actually distorted your ability to make the normal choice, the traditional choice is a much better word, of actually sequencing it so you buy a house and then you save like hell. And so I think you've got to think really hard about superannuation. You probably know that we wrote something for CEDA suggesting that young people should be able to access their superannuation savings to buy a house. So you need both an income and a house when you retire and in the rest of your life. And having one sort of rule to run how you buy houses, another set of rules as to how you save for income is just ridiculous.
I think, before I get Jen to respond to the point on superannuation, because I know you've got some views on that, just to make another observation relevant to Rod's comment, I think you're absolutely right. There's no golden rule that everyone must own a house. But when we have a look what's been happening to home ownership, and we look at falling home ownership rates amongst young people, what we see is that has largely been driven by falling home ownership amongst low-income young people. So if you're in the top 20% of 25 to 34-year-olds in terms of income, you're just as likely to own a home today as someone in that same group 30 years ago. Almost all of the fall has been driven by people at the lower end of the income spectrum. So I think what we're seeing is not just a symptom of intergenerational inequality, it's inequality in the broad. And that's why I think there's sort of broader social issues at work there.
And that's why I do, to some extent, call bullshit on the argument that older people sometimes make that younger people actually don't want the same things that they wanted. Because Danny's absolutely right. If you look at people who have the wherewithal to get into the property market and do all of those sort of traditional things, they're still doing them. They still want to do them. People broadly still want the same things that people have wanted in Australia for 100 years. They want a stable and secure life. They want a family. They want a place to put that family, but for some of us that is just not a realistic proposition, and so then there are a range of different things that people do instead. But the idea that we don't want those things, I think, has become a bit of a post facto rationalisation for the fact that the people who have them don't want to give up the things that would allow us to have them. So that's one point. But just to go back to superannuation, because I am a huge supporter of the compulsory super system. Partly that's because I'm a Labor person and we see compulsory super as one of the very great achievements of the modern Labor Party, so I'll put that out there now. But I also believe in the behavioural economics insight that people are really bad about planning for their futures. They're really bad at estimating what they would need in the future and then rigorously putting aside, for example, the savings that would allow them to get there. And the problem at the moment with removing compulsory super for young people is that 10% of extra income is still not necessarily going to be enough to allow them to put together a house deposit. So what you're doing is you're saying take away the compulsory requirement to save, and essentially they still won't be able to get the thing that we would hope they would spend that money on. So it just kind of evaporates. So I would be really concerned about the impact on young people of taking compulsory super away.
I'm not taking compulsory superannuation away. I'm saying you can use some of those savings to buy a house. As an economist, I think the basic problem with the housing market is on the supply side. We're not building enough houses, and we haven't built enough houses for most of the last decade. And that's one of the main reasons we've got this ridiculous spike in prices. As I said, I went through a period when we bought a house where the price of our house fell 20%. If we built enough houses, the price of houses in Australia would again probably fall 20%. Let's solve the supply side problem. And a lot of that's got to do with planning rules and ridiculous height rules and all sorts of restrictions, which are NIMBY sorts of effects, I think, largely. And I think we've got to get rid of them. You go and live in London or Paris or New York or Berlin, and you'd be living in an apartment close to the centre of the city. That would be the norm. And so we just have to get used to the fact that if we're going to have a big city, then we really have to have much greater densities.
The supply side is definitely a problem, but I don't think anybody really disputes that demand is also a problem in Australia, in that there is greater demand for houses than we can currently meet, and a big section of that demand does not come from owner-occupiers. It comes from people who see housing as a speculative good rather than a social good. And you talk about Germany, and one of the reasons that they have a very established culture of renting is that there are large investment vehicles which buy housing for the purpose of people to live in long term. So it's a very different arrangement from here in Australia, where people will invest in one property or two properties and be an individual landlord. My concern is that some of the tax policies that we have in particular really encourage investment in housing over occupier housing, and that leads to a mismatch between supply and demand.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the tax things in a minute. I think that's probably the next question. I think one of the things that's going to have to change is actually renters are going to have to be better protected. One of the things you do go to Germany, you see those countries where most people rent, there are actually much stronger protections of the interests of the renting party. And I think that's one of the policy changes we need to see in Australia, is introducing much more protection. If people aren't going to own their own homes, they're going to rent, then we need to actually have a proper legal structure to support that.
I should say, before you guys all came in, Rod was saying that he disagreed with almost everything in the first half of the book, which was the problems, but agreed with most of the things in the second half, which was the solutions. And better laws that favour renters is one of the things that I talk about as being really important, because, you know, I have now moved house 9 times in 12 years, purely because as a renter you can get turfed out fairly quickly. And after my last rental inspection, the real estate agent on behalf of the landlord sent me a note saying that putting one of my son's pictures up with sticky tape could be cause for losing some of my bond. Now that's nonsense if we've got people who are living in rented accommodation for 10 or 15 years, that you can't make your house your home. And so certainly laws around renting and rights there would be a really valuable change.
So that's one thing we agree on, which is fantastic, probably on the supply side as well. So on to the issue of taxation that both of you have just flagged. Jennifer, obviously in your book you talk about tax concessions for property investment, capital gains tax discount, negative gearing as being part of the problem on the demand side. Rod, do you agree that winding back those tax concessions might be part of the solution to improving housing affordability?
I think capital gains tax has been far too generous across the board. I mean, the problem with capital gains tax is you impose a tax on the gain that somebody makes between when they buy an asset and when they sell it. Well, a lot of the difference in those two prices is actually due to inflation. So when we set up our capital gains tax concessions, inflation was running at about 7%. Now it's running at 2%. And so the concessions are just far too generous. So I would have a massive cut to the generous nature of the capital gains tax. I think doing that solves most of the problems that you're concerned about with negative gearing and all those other sort of things. I don't think you need to attack negative gearing, and I actually like the principle that if people want to borrow to invest to build a factory, they should be able to deduct the cost of borrowing. And I think that principle is probably a pretty good one to have across our tax system. Well, then you start to get people playing games at the margin as, is this one of the things for which it's allowed and one of the things for which it's not allowed? So I don't like the idea of having negative gains tax restrictions to particular markets, but I would be much, much tougher on capital gains.
Yeah, just on the negative gearing point, I mean, I agree that as a principle of tax section, it makes sense if you incur a loss in generating income that you can deduct those losses. But why should you be able to deduct them against your wage and salary income? I think that is what causes a lot of distortions in the decision making, is the fact that people are very fixated on reducing the tax bill on their wages. You could still have deductible losses, but only deductible against other forms of investment income, as they do in many other countries.
If I'm a farmer and I want to borrow to buy a new tractor, yeah, can I deduct the cost of the borrowing against my income? Obviously, yes.
Yes, but that's related
So-
income to the purchase of the tractor.
Wow, okay. So if I'm an investor and I want to actually build a new factory and I want to borrow to build that factory, and it's not going to have any earnings for the next 10 years, I actually can't deduct that against anything according to your rule. It's just, I mean, it just seems silly.
I like to think of it, you know, every tax concession is something that we all contribute to. So every time someone gets a concession, the rest of us don't get something that tax revenue could have paid for. And so my sort of guiding principle is that those concessions should be available for things which add value in the economy, which contribute to, you know, production, basically. And the problem with investing in housing is that it's dead capital. It sits there and it accumulates capital for no real contribution to the economy as a whole. And then, as you say, people can deduct that from their wage income. So I think it's an unfair principle for the reason that Danny's highlighted.
Wow. Only production is valuable, so none of the services are valuable. That's just nonsense. I mean, that's sort of 16th century economics.
Well, it depends how you define production, I think.
Well, if I'm producing services from something, that you're not going to count that as production.
Well, no, I would count that as production because you are adding to the net value of things in the economy. How does investing in a property and owning it while it gains in value, what does that contribute to our commonwealth?
It provides household services. That's what it does.
But under the principle we're talking about, any losses that you generate in providing those household services are deductible just against other investment income, not against wage and salary. And that's really where we're drawing the distinction.
Yeah, well, I can't see why you just... So if I use my salary to actually buy a factory down the road, I can't, and it makes losses, I can't deduct that against my earnings as an economist. I mean, why?
Well,
What's
I think, Jen can certainly speak to the Labor policy on negative gearing, but my understanding is that active investments, such as in business income, would be deductible. But what we're talking about is passive investments. And this is not an unusual principle, Rod. This applies in a number of
doesn't make it right.
large countries,
So I buy a
including the United
pipeline.
States.
So I buy a pipeline. Is that a passive or an active investment? I buy a toll road. Is that an active or a passive investment? I mean, you're just splitting hairs. It's just nonsense.
No, I don't think it is splitting hairs. But anyway, we need to move on. Why don't we talk about another controversial area of tax concessions, since we're on the topic. You know, as both of you are aware, at the moment superannuation earnings are tax-free for people over 65 that are drawing down on their superannuation. In contrast, people that are adding to their super that are under 65 pay 15% tax on their super earnings. Given a lot of the government's fiscal pressures and given a lot of the structural issues we see with the budget going forward, do you think that tax-free status for superannuation for over 65s is sustainable? And if not, how do you think we should change it?
You're asking me?
I'll ask you first.
All right. We're a lot poorer in many ways than we were 4 or 5 years ago. So many of the things that we said we could afford and thought we could afford, you know, during the boom, are clearly now unaffordable. We actually have to wait and pay for them. So I think that superannuation concessions have been too generous as part of that general policy where we just basically gave too many people too many concessions. And so I think that a policy of pulling back a bunch of those concessions makes perfect sense. I think that having poor people pay 15% tax when they're not taxed on their income at all is ridiculous. Personally, my policy would be to say that all superannuation contributions should go from your after-tax earnings, and hence they've all been progressively taxed on the way in. I think that's a much better system for us to actually operate, and a much fairer system to operate. Yes, you can attack the people who've retired and got no way of responding to your new tax. That's possible. We don't normally do those sorts of things. I just think shifting to a tax on the way in principle for everybody solves virtually all of the problems.
I think Rod's absolutely right that one of the things which gets overlooked in the conversation about super tax concessions is actually what's going on at the bottom end, at people who are earning the very lowest incomes. So as he's pointed out, they pay more tax on their super contributions than they do on any of their other income, because they pay zero on any of their other income. And not only has the current government decided to maintain some of the very generous concessions, but they've also taken away pretty much the only measure which assisted those very low income people, which was the low income super contribution scheme. So I do think it's pretty much an outrage that we would continue to have a system where the very poorest are paying more tax than on their standard income, whereas very well off people are getting huge discounts, 30% discounts on their super contributions. So that would really be the priority for me.
But when we're talking about the issue of intergenerational inequality, all of the policies that you two have spoken about are about tax concessions on the way in. We do have a situation at the moment where people that have accumulated very large superannuation balances in a concessional tax environment are not making any contribution to the tax system after the age of 65. Do you see that as affordable going forward?
I think there is some role for taxing earnings on those investments, to a greater degree than they have been, certainly, because as Rod has said, it's true that you don't necessarily want to be changing too much about the settings that people have made decisions about. But at the same time, when we're talking about people who have very, very large balances, $2 million or more, and then they're living off earnings from that, their capacity to respond to changes in those policy settings is adequate, I think we could agree.
Yeah, I mean, I too think that we need to reconsider some of those concessions that we gave on superannuation. I just think some of them are far too generous.
And it's an interesting point, actually, when you look at capital gains tax concessions, for example, as well, where you go back 15 years to when these things were changed, and we just didn't know how they were going to play out necessarily. And I think it's a really valuable principle in public policy generally to say, we tried this, it had this impact that we really didn't anticipate, and so now we need to draw a line in the sand and change it, because none of these settings are permanent or set in stone. They are all there because parliaments and the community have decided to leave them in place. So there's no reason that we shouldn't change them now that we've realised they're causing a problem. It's not to say that they were set up with malice or ill will or anything like that, and I talk quite a lot in the book about how older generations today, obviously they didn't accrue this advantage on purpose, and nobody's at fault for this, but it is a function of a range of policies which have played out in ways we didn't anticipate and which we therefore need to rethink.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, why don't we move on to talking about university fees? Obviously, one difference we see with the current generation is they're going to be entering the workforce with far greater university debt than the generations that went before them. But at the same time, we are hearing about the growing cost of HECS to government budgets, particularly since the vocational education and training system has been brought into the HECS umbrella. And there's been a lot of debate about how the government might change policy to make the system more sustainable. We've had a government sort of put on the table fee deregulation, take it off. I think it's sort of partially back on the table again.
Hanging off the edge.
Hanging on the edge. We've had sort of what I would say are more incremental proposals, including from the Grattan Institute, that you might reduce the income threshold for HECS repayments. Do both of you see the current HECS system as a good one, and do you think that any of these sort of policy changes are required?
I think I'll say up front that the HECS system is amazing at giving a lot more people access to university than would previously have been able to do so. So if we still had a situation that we had prior to the Whitlam government, where only people who could afford to pay cash up front went to university, we would be much the poorer as a country. And certainly as well, it's not unreasonable to expect young people to make some contribution to their university study, given that we know by and large they will earn a premium for that over their lives, although that premium is eroding and you're needing 2 degrees rather rather than one to get the same kind of bang for your buck that you used to, and those are all problems we could talk about. But there is a difference between accepting that university should cost something and that people should make a contribution to their own education, to saying that it should be this open market, free for all, the universities can charge whatever they want for it. Because there is also a really huge social good in tertiary education. And I find it really amusing when this debate about fee dereg was going on. Christopher Pyne was trying to, I think he thought he was trying to G people up who didn't go to university, to say, well, the 60% of people who don't go to university are subsidising the 40% of people who do. And he said it a number of times, and every time I just thought, how does he feel about untrained surgeons stitching people up? Is he okay with untrained primary school teachers teaching people to read? Hopefully not. And that's the social value of education. Even people who don't go to university benefit from us having a very large number of university-trained people in the community, and therefore it's reasonable to expect that we as a community would contribute to that, I believe.
Okay, I guess I disagree with how you set the question up, Danny. I don't think that HECS is an issue of intergenerational fairness. It's a question of fairness within a generation. Yeah, which I think where you got to at the end of the conversation. So it's a different conversation, yeah? So, and we all agree that some of the benefits are social and some are private, and there should be some contribution. I think we've sort of established that. But I just think it's just misleading to treat it as an intergenerational issue when I don't think it is. I think it's a generational issue. You've just got to decide whether the educated people in your generation are going to be how much are going to be subsidised by the uneducated people in your generation. So I think that's really the fundamental issue, and yeah, we can talk about something else.
No, let's stick with this for a little minute. Because where I think it becomes an intergenerational issue is in the frame that the Abbott government set it up with in the 2014 budget, which was, we have this looming debt crisis, we have a growing older population that we can't afford to pay for, and so fee dereg and big cuts to university funding are part of our solution to solving that. We are paying for things we need to pay for in the future by cutting back on paying for university. That's where I think it actually becomes an intergenerational issue. And that conversation has got a bit messed up, and some of you may have seen there was a big flame war on Twitter last week. Stephen Koukoulas wrote a very controversial piece about housing in The Guardian, and then another young columnist fired back, and all of the internet was aflame for a day. And one of the things that he just kind of said offhand was that you guys shouldn't resent us for having got free university. And I don't really, people might say things around the edges. I don't really know anybody who resents older people for having got those free degrees. What we resent is then the assumption that you can continue putting more and more costs on younger people in order to pay for other things elsewhere in the budget. That's the real crux of the issue here, I think.
Yeah, we have to balance the budget. Certainly we have to find savings somewhere. That's agreed, or we have to raise revenue somewhere. I don't think, again, that is an argument, and I think that each generation really should pay for itself. As I said, we paid for our generation, the generation before us, for the war and for all of the infrastructure. And I think the fact that you're allowing deficits to be run at the moment is just crazy. I think that the failure of Pyne was actually not to say that we're going to let the university have free for all, but not to say that we're going to tax Melbourne University 80% of its income on whatever it charges for a medical degree. I think it's nonsense that you've got this monopolist institution sitting up the road here, which is able to charge under this model anything at all, using public funds which have set it up and supported it for more than 100 years, I guess 150 years, and yet they're able to cream off all of the benefits of this public investment and do with it whatever they want. I mean, the problem was, I think, not with the fact that he was going to deregulate, but that he wasn't going to impose a tax on all those monopolists who are going to exploit their monopoly power. This is just sort of some standard distribution policy.
Some claps. Look, we need to move to audience questions, but just before we do, I wanted to ask you both if there was one policy that you could choose to put in place to improve the lives of young Australians today, what would you choose?
Wow. Can I have two?
All right, you can have two, as long as you're fast.
Okay. My short-term one is actually to take a lot of the restrictions on housing supply off. I think that's just complete nonsense. We allow people to keep people out of the supply side of the market. That will solve many of the housing problems. That's a short-run thing. The longer-run thing is we've actually got to address the ageing of the population, and I think the sensible thing there is actually to rapidly increase the retirement age. people should be required to work longer or wait for longer to be on public benefits. That will solve many of the longer term budgetary problems which are pending after, 2018 or 2019.
I think we possibly agree on that. I have two also. The biggest one for me is education and training. So I mentioned before the 60% of young people that will not go to university in Australia. We don't do anywhere near enough to skill and equip those people to make sure they are able to face the kind of future that is ahead of them, and particularly one where skills will change very rapidly, industries will change very rapidly, and they will need to adapt to that. We need to do a lot more with those young people, and improving the quality of our vocational education and training system, I think, is really, really important to that. So that would probably be my number one thing. My other one is just around organising and about the fact that young people don't get involved across the board in a whole range of ways. So we don't join unions, we don't join political parties, we don't show up. And I think if there's one thing that I wanted people my own age and younger to take away from the book, it was the idea that showing up makes a difference. Coming to hearings and being in political parties and doing all of those things which has come to be seen as a bit lame, caring about things is just not very cool, is a bullshit cop-out on our future, frankly.
Great note to finish on. All right, so this is a wonderful chance for people in the audience to show us how cool they are and how much they care by asking a question. We could start with this woman in the front row. If you can just speak right into the microphone.
Is it doing the thing? Oh, fantastic. So how does intergenerational differences in wealth track with race? So, for example, are Aboriginal children and Aboriginal youth better off now than they were 20 years ago? Are some people of Southeast Asian descent better off now than they were 20 years ago? Why do you think that is, and why hasn't that been discussed yet tonight?
No, that's a really good point, and one of the absolute critical failings of public policy in Australia over the last 20 years is that those outcomes have not got a lot better for Indigenous young people in particular, and in some cases they have got worse. People of Southeast Asian descent, I'm not so sure on. I mean, off the top of my head, I would say that purely because diaspora communities are becoming more established and things, those outcomes may well have got better, but you're absolutely right. The condition of Indigenous young Australians is making very little progress, and that's something that should really concern all of us. I suppose it's not something that I touched on in the book because the focus of the book, or the conceit of the book, if you will, is that it's telling my life story with data. And to be honest, I'm a white girl from Canberra. I have very little capacity to reflect on those kind of experiences, and I think in a way it would have been arrogant of me to try and do that, but it's a good point to draw our attention to, absolutely.
I'd like to ask, what do you think the impact of inheritance will be? Like, I'm a member of the millionaire class, old people. Tweak some. How will that set of generations?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's something, certainly when we were writing the Wealth of Generations report, we had a lot of people come to us and said, well, won't inheritance solve this issue? Clearly, to the extent you've got older people accumulating wealth, that's going to be passed on at some point in time. But what the very sort of limited data we have on inheritances tells us is that inheritances tend to go to people later in life, so people in their 50s, 60s and beyond, which is not often the time that you actually need that money. And they tend to go to people that are already wealthy. So what you see is a concentration in wealth because of inheritances. So for some people that's great and that will help address the issue, but for particularly the lower income people that are falling behind, a lot of them can't rely on inheritance to address the issue.
And it's a good point, actually, and it takes us back to something that Rod said right at the start, which was that we will live 8 years longer, and in some cases much longer than that again, and that's a huge benefit, in lifetime well-being. And I think that may be true, but it's also a sort of slightly economist-y way of looking at things, and some of my best friends are economists. But if you have a very long life and then in the last few years of it you end up quite well off because you've inherited some money or you finally managed to pay off your mortgage and those kinds of things, you've still struggled for quite a significant period. And I'm not sure that averaging the wealth that you might have by the end of your life over your very long number of years actually makes the challenge of those other years any less. And in fact, I'm almost certain that it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, the average superannuation balance, the median superannuation balance is 0. So yes, there will be a group of people, but not very many, I think. And when I lived in the US, I mean, it was one of the things that worried the hell out of me, just seeing the importance of inherited wealth and the cumulative effect over decades and probably centuries, decades anyway, of this accumulation of wealth. And I do think in Australia, we will need to think about wealth taxes at some stage. I mean, there is already a wealth tax in the superannuation system, as you know, but we probably will have to revisit, I think, as a country in sometime in the future.
Gentleman there.
Just an extension of what we've been talking about here. The biggest contributor to wealth, as I understand it, is the family home. Neither of you, or none of you refer to it, but surely taxing the family home, or the anomaly of the family home as an untaxed item, must be one of the biggest contributors to this difference between the generations.
Yep, fantastic. You probably read my paper for CEDA again, which recommended that it's just complete nonsense at the moment that we don't include the house in or any of the pension tests or means tests. That's again something which, difficult as it is, ultimately we're going to have to address. It's just nonsense at the moment. If we actually included those things in all of the tests, then people would have incentives to find ways to actually release some of the income implicit in their houses. So I agree completely.
And of course, the other way we can tax the family home is through a broad-based land tax. So that is certainly something that economists have been advocating for a long time. It's an incredibly efficient tax. You know, state governments are looking for a way to raise revenue, and certainly Grattan Institute has been on the record as recommending a sort of low-rate, broad-based tax across the board on property. Yep, so gentleman in the corner there first, and then the man in the red jumper.
Thanks. While I understand the principle of not changing or not disadvantaging people who have made certain decisions based on previous policy, if with something like the superannuation you end up with a generation who have been able to take advantage of that, and then a future generation that is not able to, how do you then generate some income or some form of taxation on those who have already taken advantage of it? And I'm thinking particularly if you're generating an income, a considerable income out of your superannuation, at the moment that's untaxed and you're not even paying a Medicare levy on that income. And to me that seems quite unfair.
Yeah, I think we already agreed that the concessions are too generous.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it is part of a broader point, though, that whenever we start talking about changes to tax concessions, the automatic response is, well, you need to grandfather that. And, you know, if you pull up the drawbridge every time, all you're doing is exacerbating these issues of intergenerational inequality. You're saying, well, yes, young people today, you're going to have to pay more tax so that people can enjoy these concessions, but too bad for you, once you get there, you're not going to get them yourself. So I think, you know, when we talk about grandfathering, we should think about those intergenerational effects.
I don't think you should express these things in intergenerational terms. That sounds like you're setting up conflict all the time, Danny. It seems to me that this is just a policy which we put in place which we can no longer afford. Let's not blame somebody for it. I mean, let's just say we need to do this better and we've made a mistake, let's fix it.
Although the arguments for retaining it are often made in terms which are implicitly generational. So we say we need to maintain the current super concessions because otherwise more people will be on the pension and then we can't afford the pension. So the way that this whole conversation happens tends to implicitly set up an older versus younger frame.
Yeah, let's undo that when that's just not productive for us as a society.
I mean, I don't think it's blame to simply point out that you're asking a group of people to pay for something that they're not going to receive the benefit from.
The title of the book is called Generation Less. That sounds very...
I'm up for a fight.
Jen wants to sell books. That's
It actually did have a different title originally, but the publishers thought it wasn't sexy enough, so sorry.
The gentleman in the red jumper there.
I just want to go back to the proposition that because the population is living for 8 years longer, that is an advantage. Because I can remember being told repeatedly by particularly Joe Hockey that the problem that Australia faced was that people are living too long, and that they, as a result of that elongated life, have elongated demands on the social service system, both for medical and for pension payments. Could we re-examine whether the extra 8 years of life is an unequivocal advantage, or it's partly an advantage and partly a disadvantage?
Well, I would like to live forever if I could, like given the option. So I'm in the camp of thinking that longer life is good life. But I think you've sort of raised an interesting point to come back to how Joe Hockey set this frame up of, you know, how are we going to afford this future where we've got so many old people around? And the reality is that the old people of the future are not going to look like the old people of today. They are going to be healthier. They are going to be in work longer. That didn't quite come out the way that I intended, but they are not going to represent the same demand on our services as they do currently. And so I think, you know, part of this panic about how are we going to afford the future is kind of sometimes based on a bit of an assumption that there will be the same requirement for services at the age of 65, say, as there is currently. And there just won't be, because people will be healthier. They won't be having the same need for healthcare services. They will likely still be working at 65 because we're moving towards a, you know, services kind of knowledge-based economy where it's not as hard on your body as being a chippy or, you know, working with your hands. So it's important, I think, to think about what the service need of the future is going to be, as well as, you know, worrying about some of those other issues. The idea about flexibility and us having more opportunity to travel and hop jobs and settle down later and live in different cities and all of that stuff, those benefits only accrue to people of privilege. They only accrue to people who have good quality education, who come from well-off families, who would have been okay regardless of what the conditions were. Things like stability at work, entry-level jobs that carried you through your career, vocational training on the job, those things benefited people who were not already well off, and they made sure that they were able to have stable and secure lives. What's being lost is the capacity for those people in particular to get ahead. And so when we talk about flexibility and how great the benefits are, they're only great for people who are already well off, frankly.
Yeah, and I don't think that's right.
You shock me.
Well, I mean, how many people here have not travelled outside Australia?
I'm not sure this is a hugely representative sample of the Australian community, right?
Yeah, but I mean, that's a nice example, isn't it? I don't think that a lot of the people who go backpacking are necessarily from upper class families. I don't think the people you see in Bali or Phuket or wherever are actually rich. I mean, I'm just struggling with this idea that you can't enjoy the richer and more interesting life that we have these days unless you're rich. That just seems wrong.
It's not really so much about things like travel or owning an iPhone or things like that where I think it bites. And the point about that as well is that everyone's benefited from that. Older people enjoy their iPhones just as much as younger people, and older people enjoy cheap overseas travel just as much as younger people.
But we didn't enjoy it when we were your age.
This is true. But it's more about things like stability of lives because of housing tenure and stability of work and those kind of areas where I think it's a real problem. And that is where I don't think anybody could dispute that those inequalities are becoming more severe in those areas.
Yeah, and I think when we actually look at consumption patterns, and we haven't sort of done this work for Australia, but I've certainly seen some good data for the UK, when we don't see young people spending a lot more on technology or leisure time, we actually see the biggest increase in spending for young people are for education and for housing. So I think even though they may have these broader social opportunities, that's great, the cost of living is actually biting in terms of the educational cost and the housing costs.
So, but that's what the cost of living deflator does. So when you measure these things in real terms, this generation is much richer than previous generations, in real terms. Take into account those things.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to speak to this point about generations today having so much more choice, because I think It's very dangerous for us to start thinking about this as a generational problem in Australia when this is a global world systems issue of protected countries, which the World War generations previous were very aware of the fact that they were fighting in a world system, and the baby boomers did not have to go and fight in wars the same way that their parents did. And frankly, the war today that younger people face is not necessarily one with bullets and guns, but it is one of labour forces and gaining meaningful employment. And you may need to go and fight a war, except it's not in Vietnam, it's now in Silicon Valley or London or these places. And I think that this issue around having more choice, we have to stop thinking of this as a generation like we didn't get to go shopping in as many places as you get to go shopping in, is a very insular way of looking at a big world systems problem, and it's one that younger people are having to face every day at work. And when we're going to work, there are now 4 generations at work. There are 4 generations wanting different things, but the commonality, as you've all said, is that they do all want to live in houses. And for some people that is completely unaffordable. They'd also like to have meaningful relationships. If their work is so insecure and difficult and unable to open up pathways for them, then these social effects need to be understood. And in one way, maybe our younger generations are in a situation which is more like the World War generations. And in that sense, maybe the baby boomers are the exception. And I think there's a frustration around baby boomers not seeing themselves as that exception.
It's a good point, actually, what you said at the start there about reminding that, Australia is operating in a very globalised context now, and this is definitely not a problem which is unique to Australia. We're seeing this happen certainly across the advanced economies, and in some cases the less developed economies are even worse off because they've got so many young people that are coming through and they're really, really struggling with things like transitions to work. So it's a really good point that this is definitely not a problem that's unique to Australia.
Wow. Have you ever heard of the Cold War? I mean, one of the reasons that I decided not to have kids until I was in my 30s was because I seriously thought that nuclear holocaust was most likely. And after the Russians invaded Afghanistan, anybody here is my generation will say, we actually thought that there was a serious chance the world would be blown up within a year or 2 years or some short period of time. We lived in a huge period of intellectual challenge which was global. I mean, yes, my friends did go to Vietnam and fought against bullets, but also we spent all of our lifetime under the shadow of global annihilation. I just think that you're probably being unfair.
So I would probably disagree with your assessment that we are doing great on skills and on education. I think that is true in, as I've said, the 40% of people who go to university. I don't think it's anywhere near true for the 60% of people who don't. So for example, 100,000 less people started an apprenticeship in 2015 than did so in 2013. We're not, a huge number of young people who are struggling to make a transition from school into work, and particularly who are dropping out of school early, and we know that they will then go on to be unemployed at a rate that's about twice as high as people who have post-secondary qualifications. What we are seeing, and it goes back to a point I was making before, is underinvestment in younger people at work in their early careers. And so then there's a skills gap emerging in a whole range of industries, and currently that's then being met by overseas labour. And I say this as a huge supporter of overseas migration. I think a big Australia is the best Australia we could possibly have. But when there is a mismatch between the skills that are in demand and the skills that are available, overseas labour becomes the way that you fill that, and then you create a conflict frame around overseas migration. When if we were better skilling the young people in Australia, then we could have people coming from overseas, and that would increase demand, because one of the quickest ways, as we know, to boost GDP is to bring in more people because they create demand. Then you wouldn't have that same conflict frame. So I guess I would dispute the premise of your question.
Yeah, I'm really heavily involved in a project at the moment on the west of Melbourne. And one of the really interesting things, especially as employment in the manufacturing sector has been hit with the automobile closing, automobile industry being reduced, is how do you actually create an environment in which the sorts of jobs you're talking about can grow and match the sorts of people who are being skilled. So getting the skills right, making sure people are actually either in the skills system or in education or in work, rather than just slipping between the gaps, I guess, is one of the really fundamental problems that we're struggling with. And I think as a city, we need to think about this a lot harder. And I do a lot of work with Victoria University, which is a vet system as well as a university system. And it's one of the problems that we are actually very, very concentrated on at the moment. So if you've got any good ideas as to how we should address some of this, please let me know.
But if you want to go to the point about growth, I mean, one of the best ways for governments to create growth is to set the signals for investment, right? So to say, here are the policy settings in which we are going to operate, and therefore people will invest and jobs will grow on the basis of that. And a really good example of that is climate policy. So we know renewable energy is a huge growth industry. Both the building of renewable energy facilities and then their operation creates jobs. It's an entirely new sector, an entirely new industry. It is quite easy for governments to say, here are our environmental policies, here are the targets that you as industry have to meet, off you go and meet them, and then industry invests. So I think it's, when you look at what governments can actually do, the kind of signals that you send for investment through policy can be really powerful. I don't think it has to be a trade-off because, for example, making housing more affordable by encouraging less speculative investment and more owner-occupying investment, that's not going to change the richness of our community. It's not necessarily going to change the other range of experiences that we can have. They're just policy choices that we have made to let things go in a particular direction. And we could make different policy choices and they would go in a different direction. So, no, I don't think it has to be a trade-off at all.
Yeah, I think I'm more inclined to agree with you than disagree. Good to finish up on a disagreeing note. I mean, I think that as a generation, the policymakers in the 1980s in Australia decided that we needed to have a much more flexible economy and society, or economy in particular, than we'd had in the past. The exchange rate goes up and down a lot more rapidly than it used to. And a lot of the traditional manufacturing industries, which are the long, stable jobs, then disappeared, and we all had to become much more agile. So I think there was a historic choice made in the 1980s, which has actually changed the nature of the society. And many of the things we're talking about are the ways in which people are trying to adapt to a world which is more flexible than the one that my parents are in anyway, operated in. So to some extent, it was a very big strategic choice. Sorry you didn't get asked. You probably weren't here at the time. And it may well have been a mistake. I mean, who knows? But I mean, the judgment we made, I think, as a set of policymakers at the time, was that it would lead to a richer and more adaptable society, and that the costs of adaptation were probably less if we had a flexible society than if we had a very rigid one. And it was a big choice, and history will tell whether we were right. I think so far the evidence is it was a good decision.
And that's a really good point, actually, because you're right, there were a whole set of decisions that were made in the 80s that really fundamentally changed what Australia is like. And I think, by and large, a lot of them were really good decisions. So it's not about saying that we need to go backwards to, for example, the really highly locked up labour market that we had, for example, or, you know, having exchange rates set by pointy heads in the Reserve Bank. Like, there are a lot of those policies which were clearly the right ones to make. But it's about, I think, going back to the values and the aspirations that people have. So people still have the same aspirations and values that we had in the 80s to some extent. But so how do we now meet those going forward in this new world in which we're operating?
I think that is an excellent note for us to finish on. Can everyone join me, please, in thanking the State Library, thanking Alex Stott from Grattan, who organised this event, and very much thanking our two panellists, Jennifer and Rodney, who have done a wonderful job with disagreeing with each other all evening.
Thank you, Rod.